Our next speaker is a local businessman, a financial planner, and I also believe this is his first time presenting something publicly that he has written. He is what do you call somebody that's a fan of Irish culture? I don't know. Celtic-phile? Irishophile? I don't know. He definitely is. Your parents are from Ireland, right? Yeah, so he's like, just a generation away. But nonetheless, he has got a very Irish story to tell you. It involves history and the IRA and terrorism and sheep. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you would please welcome Fergus Toohey.
Thanks, Brad. I'm very glad Brad asked me to do this. I always have lots of things swirling around in his head, and I needed a deadline just to get it out. That really helped. So thank you. This is a little story about an experience I had last fall. The west of Ireland is wild, a rugged, ragged beauty. God's grandeur at its greatest. Magnificent mountains, rolling green hills, lakes lining the Atlantic coast. Mom's best friend had bought a small plot out there in the 90s, before the Celtic Tiger, before the Europeans from the continent had come in and run the prices up. Mary had retired as a social worker in Dublin and built a house on the side of a mountain which sloped downwards to a deep lake. The Atlantic Sea was visible miles in the distance from her glass-walled living room. Sheep roamed all around. The ubiquitous sheep, Agnes ubiquitous. Mary's mountain was called Bucca. I had climbed to the top 10 years before, the last time I was there. I loved exploring my ancestral home. I didn't climb this time, as I had great difficulty making my way back down the last time. Bucca became very steep as you went up, and there were holes and rocks and crags and thistles and sheep shit all over. Dad had climbed it a few years back because he had heard that I had, and needed to prove to all that he could do anything I could. He was gone for several hours, and it was getting dark. Mary, Mike, Mom, and the neighbors were sick with worry, and had thought they might have to call over to Westport to request a helicopter come look for me. He eventually made it home, wet and covered in scrapes and dirt, but cheerful nonetheless. I didn't need to climb Bucca this time. I just wanted to run. I wanted to run those roads that ridden through the mountains and valleys, and around the lakes and over the streams. So I went out just after my breakfast. Rashers and eggs, and brown bread and tea. The weather app reported rain, but in the west of Ireland, that often meant 10 minutes of showers followed by sun and back to wet and wind and everything in between. Intermittent showers interspersed with rainbows and golden sun. The light changes so often in the west. Painters from all over Europe were inspired to spend time there. Dad reminded us of this every 30 minutes or so as we drove throughout the mountains the day before. That was a great tour Mary had given us in her little maroon Peugeot. The land is truly spectacular. Years before, the Irish government had built a commune out there and provided grants to artists and various media, sponsoring their stay for some months or years to live and work and produce. Skies of couple colors of brinded cow, high beauty. I had learned by this that the weather app was absolutely useless out here. So that morning, I put on a weatherproof North Face jacket, a wool ski cap, and my skimpy Nike shorts. I fixed my Puma headphones under the cap. I knew this was a safety risk, as my first day there, I had nearly been run over on a narrow road. It was mostly farmers out here, but this was a car full of 20-somethings that came up over the hill in front of me. They all looked startled as their eyes ascended the apex and met mine. No joggers out this way, usually just stray sheep, the occasional car, and the odd farmer. Today I would be more on guard and keep the volume a little lower whenever my view might be obscured. Today I would head toward the edge of town. Newport was about 4 miles from the base of Bucca. We had gone in for dinner the night before. We treated Mary and Mike in return for their hospitality and for the great tour we had that day. The first mile, once down the mountain, followed the Silver Lake. It was long but not wide, more like a fjord. Wind created white waves all around. Wild grass and heather and lavender grew all along, and limestone rocks rose from the ground all around. No stretch of land here was free of those rocks. Cromwell had run us all out this way centuries before. To hell or to Connacht, he said. The scenes are just stunning, but I could see how beauty only went so far and couldn't grow food. Though there were plenty of fish, Atlantic salmon would flood into this lake each year and spawn before heading back up in the Arctic. Scientists, I was told, had managed to tag these salmon and track them as far north as the North Pole. We had eaten some of them the night before at the Granja Whale in Newport. The pub was named for the ancient Irish woman warlord who had defended these parts from English invaders centuries before. Mom, Dad, and myself were snuggled in the tiny backseat of Mary's car. Mary, up front, instructed Mike to park close to the front door, as there had been break-ins reported that day. Someone had spotted a white van nearby. Just be careful, Mike. I made my way alongside the lakeside towards town, past the point where the road began to bend leftward and up from the waters toward Bucket's neighboring hills and back right toward town. Coming around one bend, I was greeted by the square mugs of two large cows, one brown, the other black. They looked at me with that near expressionless visage of bovine beasts, only a hint of mild curiosity betrayed. I paused for a photo. On past this field, the ground swelled and flattened. My view of the lake returned off to the right, and I saw the road to Furnace stretching out along the other side. Mary and Mike had friends down that way. Mr. Connolly and his 3 children, Roisin, Connor, and Siobhan. A poor farmer and a very decent man, he and Dad got on well. He always brought over his own batch of punching when Mom and Dad visited. One day, Dad brought a bottle of it back to the States. I discovered it in their liquor cabinet home from college one time. It burned. When I crested the next hill here, I neared the 7-arch bridge which rolled into town like a Roman aqueduct. A quarter mile before reaching the bridge, I turned my path back around, away from the town, to head home. I could again see Bucket beyond the hills. The wind picked up, and I was reminded of the story Mom had told me the day before. She traveled here with friends from Birmingham, her friend Helen, Madam Payne, who taught French in Indian Springs, and then said she had then fully understood the meaning of that part of the Irish blessing, may the wind be always at your back. On the way in, I had the blessing on my side, but now I was heading mostly into the gusts, which were particularly strong by this time. The rain had returned, so I tightened my collar around my neck and chin. I pulled my cap lower on my forehead above my eyes. By this time, I had put in sufficient miles on the varying terrain so that my endorphins were circulating. In spite of the weather, I felt good. I could now see my destination a few miles ahead, as the crow flies, as some folks like to say. My return would take me along winding roads, not a straight path, to be sure. I reached the fork and made the decision to turn right up the mountain rather than back down the lake. The sign told me I would be heading towards Furnace this way, but I fortunately knew this was not the case. The sign had been blown around and now deceived the unfamiliar traveler. I wonder how it got more secure in the earth. Surely the wind wasn't any worse today than any other out here. It must have been children. That's just the sort of thing I would have done years ago. I continued my initial ascent. This road would intersect perpendicularly with the higher road which ran along the ridge of the mountain and its neighboring hills, ultimately connecting with Bucca midway up. I turned my gaze upward and slowed my breath as I went on. With the adjustment in direction, the wind was now more on my side again, and the rain not directly in my eyes. I noticed movement along the road up above. Something white moved slowly along. Perhaps I first dismissed it as another sheep, but it now registered as something else, an automobile. It was the top of a white van. Jesus, what was I to do now? Would it be ridiculous to run back down and take the alternate route? What was the real threat here anyway? I couldn't see it now anymore. They'd probably gone on. Or perhaps they were waiting for me. The IRA had kidnapped my uncle's boss in the 1980s and held him for ransom. Then Dunn, one of the Dunn store's executives. That was during a time of particular violence in the North. The IRA financed its operations via donations from Irish expats, mainly in the U.S., and through kidnappings. Despicable. No better than those Colombian terrorists anymore. Not the IRA of Granddad's day. Dad's father fought the war 90 years back and helped win that long-sought independence from the British Empire that so many generations of Irish people longed for, unwinding Cromwell's cruel curse. This was not the same group. By this time, they were just bands of thugs who ran some disjointed criminal enterprise for its own sake. Uncle John had told me a few of them held up the Goat Grill in Dublin and ended up running over a teenage boy during their escape. The perpetrators had been apprehended, and one of them was reportedly of African descent, hardly an Irish freak inviting any worse than before. Continuing to climb, I planned my escape. How many would there be? Perhaps 3 or 4? One driving and a couple of accomplices? The fields on either side of my path were lined with barbed wire, so anyone who may have managed to hide behind a boulder or a thick patch of heather would be slow by this. Even so, I was confident I could outrun a few criminals who probably smoked cigarettes and drank too much. Even if they had guns, I doubted they would fire on me. I wouldn't be worth much to them dead. It was very rare to person anyone being shot in the public anyway, even by the few criminals who actually had guns, and that wasn't many. I considered my conflicting views on this whole situation. As a child, I was prohibited from wearing Reeboks because they displayed the Union Jack, a symbol of oppression for our people. We were Irish Catholics who had chosen conic over hell and over Protestantism. But we become Episcopalians in Alabama because Mom and Dad had enough of Rome's rules and prohibitions. I was taught to honor the lads who had served alongside Grandpa Dennis, but I recognized that this modern manifestation of that movement was not the same thing. Who was I to root for? Lines were blurred. War was over. Would I try to explain this to my captors should they manage to best me? I would tell them how Granddad was an officer and how he was respected by all the troops. After the war, he opened a tax office in Tipperary. He would help out local folks. When someone got into a bind, he would call up to Dublin and speak to the old guard, his old compatriots, and get the matter straightened out. He was an Irish hero, and I had hoped I would help these IRA men understand that I was actually not the enemy. My family doesn't have money like Ben does. Dad had actually gone to Catholic seminary at All Hallows in Dublin. They didn't need to know about the whole Episcopal Church. But then again, they really wouldn't care. The war was over. These people only wanted money, probably for drugs. I mean, what kind of militia finances itself by breaking into cars and holding up clubs anyway? I would outrun them. The intersection of the two roads was now just a dozen yards above, though the view down the new road was obscured by high grasses further down along the ridge. I couldn't see where the van had gone. It could have been hidden nearby, but I surveyed that there was sufficient clearing at the crossroads that I would surely see an ambush in time to turn and run back down. I stayed on the right side of the road as I approached the coming left turn. I plucked my earbuds from under my cap and rolled the wool above my ears. I needed all my senses for this new threat. My gaze never left the intersection as I drew near. More was revealed at each step. A short stone wall ran the length of the new road on the far end, tall grass on either side. A few sheep in the road. They must have come over the short wall. Wait, there were dozens more. They covered the road, which was now a corral for a massive flock. And there it was in the middle of them all, the van. Sheep on all sides of the road and all around me, hundreds of them. I stopped. What was this? 3 dogs ran all around barking and herding. An old man in a dirty woolen sweater lumbered animated from the cab. It was a skeleton draped in wrinkled, weathered skin. He yelled from his sparsely toothed mouth at the animals, waving his cap and shouting, returning to the cab and inching the van along. Ah, for sake, I thought. This process repeated for the next half mile before I was able to get over the rock wall and manage enough speed along the rocky field to make an attempt to get around them and back on the road to Mary's. While running alongside them, I stepped into a hole and managed to scrape my calf along the thistles and crags inside. Jesus! My would-be captors had only managed to rob me of my time in the end. I feared by this that Mary would have sent for that helicopter from Westport. I came in to find them all at the table gathered for lunch, unbothered by my late return. When I told them what I had seen, Mike says, sure, it must have been old Tom O'Malley bringing his sheep back up the mountain. Sure, he's a lovely man, he is. I'd have many more runs this trip, and after, to take in the beauty of this land, to wonder how long the O'Malleys had been laboring in these parts, and to try and sort out the myriad contradictions and ironies swirling in my mind. Thanks be to God.